Welcome back to which is the Canada Coach Academy podcast. This is our 5th episode. And today I'm coming to you with a fairly heavy topic. Heavy in the sense that it's important to talk about. And it's a topic that comes up in coaching a lot, which carries a lot of emotion. So given the state of the world today, October 17th, a lot of crisis happening, a lot of grief and what we call collective grief happening around us. So I thought that it was a really good time to introduce the topic of grief in coaching and to look at the different aspects of grief, what that means for people, and also looking at tools and strategies coaches can use to support people through grief, which I think is the most important thing that I can talk to you about from my perspective and experience. So today, the first thing I want to start with is a statement by Lucy Hone, who is a woman who wrote a book called Resilient Grieving. And she comes to grief from a very tragic personal story, losing her daughter at the age of 14 in a car accident that took not only her daughter's life, but her daughter's best friend and mother's life. And she is someone who studies and researches not just grief, but resilience and positive psychology around the topic of grief. So Lucy Hone says, coping with death is as fundamental to our human experience as finding a mate or having children. We don't want it to be, but it is. And I find this statement very interesting because when you study grief, as I am currently in a course with Harvard, you look at cultural aspects of grief, and we recognize that in non-Western cultures, grief has a very different and significant meaning. Grief is often seen as a part of life. And what does that mean? It means that grief is, or death is, as expected as life. And so coping strategies around grief and death and loss of life are different, more weaved into society and to the daily lives, and not seen as a tragic event, but an event of fate, a fated event. So super interesting when you look at grief from different perspectives. But for today, we know that one of the hardest parts of loss is accepting the loss. And one of the things that I found interesting when I was taking this course and learning about aspects of grief is all of the different language around grief that I think is important to recognize, because grief is very complex and much more complex than I realized. Disenfranchised grief is something that you might hear of a lot since COVID, and that is the act of experiencing grief that is never really acknowledged, like the loss of an event or the loss of an ex-partner that you're no longer linked to but still mourn, or the loss of a job, or the loss of a goal that never came to be. This is what we call disenfranchised grief because it's not really recognized or acknowledged as loss. And people who experience it don't feel worthy of experiencing the grief around it. So we saw that a lot in the pandemic with weddings being canceled last minute, and the bride and groom having this expectation of a beautiful wedding with family and friends, flowers and venues canceled at the last minute, and so much money invested couldn't be recouped. Or the Olympian training for the big event and not being able to compete. or the child who was expecting to go to their prom that year and it was canceled. That type of grief today is so common. And what we as coaches can do is to support people to recognize first that they are allowed to grieve, even though it's not loss of life and may not seem as extreme or drastic. They are allowed to grieve for those losses, and it's important to validate those losses. So we're going to look at some steps to validation. But for now, think about all of the people that you know, or maybe it's you yourself, who lost something and you felt like you weren't really justified in grieving that loss because so many others lost life in the pandemic. Ambiguous grief is a grief that has no closure. This, to me, could potentially be the hardest grief to cope with, in that there's no close to it. There's this kind of opening that is left, and it's not filled with any kind of closure that can help a person move forward. Ambiguous grief can look like a missing person, physically gone, but psychologically still present. Or it can be someone who has a brain injury or a mental disorder like dementia that has them psychologically lost, but physically present. So these are two types of ambiguous grief that are so interesting that I never really considered or named it before. And I think that when we know the name ambiguous grief and what that means for people, we can help them and support them through recognizing and acknowledging their emotions around this. What's considered normal grief is your typical responses to grief. That includes a range of emotions like sadness, anger, guilt, disbelief. This is what we call normal, but in no way is it easy or even understandable in many ways. But these includes physical and emotional symptoms. Complicated grief is when those symptoms go on unresolved. Complicated grief is usually prolonged and doesn't improve with time. People who experience prolonged grief often struggle to come up with accepting the loss, and they experience intense emotional pain. Anticipatory grief is when you are, anticipating a loss, when you are potentially terminally ill, and you have a terminally ill relative or child or family member. People experience a vast range of emotion, and this includes sadness, anxiety, but other things as well. So although coaches are not therapists, we can still support people through the emotions of a anticipatory grief situation. We're going to be looking at the stages of grief that were originally designed or thought of by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. There are 5 stages that deal with this kind of anticipating death grief. Collective grief, which is, I think, so present today in our society. This is the grief of a group of people grieving a community event or a response to a tragic event that affects many people. It could be a natural disaster, or it could be acts of terrorism and war, or maybe it's the death of a public figure that we collectively mourn. So collective grief can increase our sense of unity and solidarity and community. And it can also create divides. So we want to understand that it's normal and even expected to feel collective grief, especially in a time like this when there's so much strife in the Middle East. It's really hard to understand, and it's normal to feel sad for the people who are losing lives. All people, no matter who you are, losing life is so hard. And we experience it through the news. We experience it through the people we know that it touches, and from, degrees of separation or firsthand. And that type of grief also needs to be recognized and validated. Secondary grief could be experienced by people who have lost someone not directly associated to them, but friends of someone else, or, that touches you. The tragedy touches you. Even though it's not personal to you, you feel the pain of others, an empathetic response to grief. And that is also something that needs to be validated and responded to. Chronic grief is long-term and often persists over time. People continue to struggle. It impacts their daily function. It's really present every day. And that is something that typically would be dealt with by a therapist, not a coach. Delayed grief, which actually has been debated and researched, does it exist? Because everybody has a different coping style with grief, because we all approach grief differently. Some people say that if you're not experiencing anger, sadness, or anxiety over grief right away, that if your reaction to grief doesn't fit normal, that you may have a delayed response to grief. While others say that perhaps some of us are more resilient than others when it comes to coping with grief. And so that response may be healthy and normal for me, but not for the next person. So although there is some debate around delayed grief, what it is experiencing a postponed grief. And then cumulative grief, which happens over time. Multiple losses could be involved. Could be over long or short periods, depending on the situation. But it typically involves multiple occurrences piling up on each other. And again, that would, if needing to be dealt with, would most likely be dealt with a therapist, because coaches can support people emotionally through that in today and what they want to, and what people want to design for their future, immediate or long-term future around grief and their response to grief. But we can't help people analyze, understand, and process that from a therapeutic point of view as a coach. So these types of grief may overlap. They may coexist. But one thing that we want to really understand as humans first, and then as coaches, is that grief shows up in different ways for different people. There's no standard. And so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was the author of, I believe it's called Death and Dying, designed these 5 stages of grief after interviewing people who were on their deathbed, basically looking at terminal illness and knowing that they were going to die. So the context of these stages of grief are really around people who are grieving the loss of their own life. And those 5 stages were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And her research was very well known. It was conducted in 1969. And it really did kind of start a conversation around grief that maybe didn't exist before her research. And although her research is very well received and respected, there has since been an opportunity to challenge her findings. And the challenge is really around, is grief so linear and predictable in its order? Can we really say that those stages represent the common responses, or is the emotional response to grief much more varied and complex than that. So research since has challenged the universality of her stages and application of them. And just basically thinking about what are those stages not willing to represent about grief? That we want to, also recognize that her research didn't necessarily apply to people from different cultural backgrounds or, even different types of death. And also, it didn't really apply, or when she was doing the research, she was speaking to people who were dying. But these stages of grief have been applied to people who have lost people who are in bereavement. And her research was not necessarily aimed at supporting that when it was being done. So since then, researchers like Lucy Hone, as I mentioned earlier, have come up with stages of grief that involve resiliency and positive psychology, coping strategies that help people on their journey through grief after losing someone. And Lucy Hone promotes the idea that individuals can develop skills and attitudes needed to navigate grief in a healthy and constructive way, even in the worst situations, most tragic times. And that begins with a choice. Of course, it begins with a choice to decide on what you focus on when you're grieving. So her research is focused on resilience building. And at the center of it is this idea that we can all build resilience and well-being even in the face of the worst circumstances, if we choose to foster emotional strength and adaptability. And I think that's super interesting because as coaches, that's really what we're doing with our clients every day. We're fostering emotional strength and adaptability. Coaching is all about disrupting habitual behavior, but also it's about adapting to change. We call ourselves change scientists or change agents sometimes because we are people who study change for a living. Coaches are change scientists, if you will. And so I appreciate Lucy Hone's approach because what it is looking at adaptability of people to change, and the hardest kind of change, which is to lose someone that you love. Her strategies include focusing on the things you can control. As coaches, we always talk about intentional being or intentionality in living. So choosing your focus is an element that you can control. You can't control the loss. You may not be able to control the sadness, but you can control what you focus on. You can also control the meaning that you give the loss. So looking for meaning and purpose in any way that you need to, whether it's spiritual or otherwise, looking for a meaning that you can appreciate about this loss and what it means for you, for the world, for others around you. She also suggests developing a growth mindset, building on small wins each day, looking at progress over time, and trying not to get stuck in a moment. Keep going, keep moving. And recognizing that even though the grief is unbearable at times, it is continually changing. She also encourages open and honest conversation around grief and resilience. We tend to not want to talk about death and dying in Western culture. as though it's the part of life that we don't want to admit happens, or we don't want to allow close to us for fear of it. And so she encourages opening up conversation and allowing people who have lost someone to talk about it. And I think as coaches, one thing we do so well is hold space for people's emotion and silence so that they can talk through what's on their mind and what's in their hearts. And so this is one thing that we can certainly do as coaches without diving into any crossover to therapy at all, which is to just allow people to sit in their emotions, to honor their emotions, and to help them recognize what that emotion means for them and what it's telling them about this situation and themselves. And then helping them to design what they want now and what they want for their future around that emotion. She also says creating safe spaces for people is important. Safe spaces where they can talk about the person, name them, tell stories, and not feel like they're bringing anyone else down. Safe spaces where they don't have to deny the loss, but to deal with it, to talk about the pain and the hurt and the suffering. And she promotes a holistic approach, which in coaching we talk about the whole person approach all the time. The physical, emotional, and psychological well-being of a person, each one of those components matter in how we approach healing. And then she emphasizes self-care, self-compassion, and the importance of social support. So when you think about loss, you think about, first of all, self-care, taking time for yourself, prayer or meditation, sleep, nutrition, self-compassion, ridding yourself of any shame or guilt around a loss or around not being yourself after a loss. And then the importance of social support or a network around you, people that you can rely on, people that you can talk to and relate to. Maybe it's a support group, maybe it's counseling, maybe it's coaching, maybe it's therapy, or maybe it's walking with a good friend. So Lucy Hone's work is really important in today's resilience building talk around grief. And her work relies on somewhat on the work of George Bonanno, who is a prominent psychologist known for his research in resilience, particularly in the context of losing someone, coping with trauma, or even adversity. So Bonanno identifies key steps and strategies for building resilience that I think are worth mentioning, because resiliency is not just around grief, but around any challenge or adversity in life. And it's always good to learn how to build resilience. And as a coach, we want to support people to build resilience. And I actually think that coaching in itself is building resilience. So Bonanno says people have different natural coping styles, and that we need to recognize and acknowledge the different ways that people cope with adversity. He also says that developing the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, in other words, being open to possibilities and ways and approaches of coping. And coaches introduce new possibilities and new choices all the time by creating and evoking awareness in conversation. Bonanno talks about learning to manage our emotions effectively. Coaching is a space in which we recognize and validate emotion. And so I think coaching and that emotional regulation go hand in hand. Strong social connections as well, looking at how resilience is built through connection. And coaching is an activity that is built on connection, right? When two people come together to be coach and coached, they partner as equals. And we often call it this dancing in the moment. So recognizing that connection is a big part of coaching, and that it is also a big part of resilience building. Cultivating a sense of optimism and hope. When we talk about coaching, we talk about appreciative questions and appreciative stances, looking for an opportunity to reframe or to move people towards something they want, not what they don't want. Banana also talks about self-care as a priority. And coaching is directly correlated in the research with self-care and in emotional intelligence building. So I think you get those two things from coaching as well. And that idea of having a partner to collaborate with in your resilience building. And that partner is the coach who is there to mirror, to observe, and to help raise awareness. And knowing that coaching happens over time. When we talk about coaching, we talk about building incremental wins over time to recognize change. And so building resilience is an ongoing process, as Bonanno says. And so this ongoing nature of coaching and ongoing nature of resilience building go hand in hand. And finally, I think what I would like to touch on is two tools that I have used in my coaching and that I've introduced in our courses to students as strategies for helping others through emotion, heavy emotion, whether it's grief or otherwise. Heavy emotion can be anger. It can be sadness, not related to grief necessarily. It can also be anxiety. It can also be intense joy, believe it or not. And positive emotion that can be distracting if it's not recognized or acknowledged or validated. So there's two tools and strategies that I use. One is by Mark Brackett, who wrote Permission to Feel, and he's also the founder of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And he came up with the concept called RULER. RULER stands for recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate. So if we think about a coaching context using this RULER framework, it would be using it to formulate questions. So R is recognize. We might ask the question, what are you noticing is coming up for you right now? That would be the first question to create recognition of something you're feeling. Then understand, we might ask, what are you willing to learn from this emotion? So asking somebody to investigate what's come up for them. And then label could be to give it a name. If you wanted to give this awareness, this new awareness that you've created for yourself, a name, what would it be? Labels can help us to express ourselves. And of course, the next stage in RULER is express. So express. What else do you want to say about those feelings, you might ask as a coach? What else is coming up for you? What might be some healthy ways to express these feelings? And then regulate, because we know that emotional regulation goes hand in hand with emotional intelligence. So what might you do to self-regulate when these emotions arise for you or when you get triggered? What are some steps or actions that you can do or take to regulate your emotions in an intense moment? And those are some questions that you can ask as a coach around that framework of RULER. Another framework is Tara Brach, who's known in meditation circles. She's written some great books. She has some meditations on YouTube. And her process is called RAIN. And RAIN stands for recognize, acknowledge, investigate, and non-identify. So RAIN is another very similar to RULER. And another way just to frame questions. You know, if you want to recognize, it's what's happening right now? What's actually happening? Could be a question that you ask as a coach, or it could be the one that you asked earlier with RULER, which was what are you noticing is coming up for you? Either way, you're asking people to create awareness around what's actually going on for them in the moment they're in. Acknowledge could be, you could ask, what are you willing to acknowledge about that emotion, about this situation, about yourself right now? And then investigate. What do you want to learn from this emotion? That could be a question. Or what might this emotion be telling you or teaching you? How has this emotion protected you so far, up to now? What meaning do you want to give this emotion? And then maybe even challenging a little with what else could be true, because coaches disrupt our habitual ways of thinking. So to disrupt it is to challenge what else could be true. What other perspective could you adopt? What other meaning exists for this? And when that's true, what possibilities arise? And then non-identify, N in RAIN, is non-identify. Non-identify is important because it helps us move from subjectivity, which is the story we're telling ourselves about this situation, to objectivity, which is a much more factual-based perspective. So we help people move from subjective to objective. So that might be sounding like if you're, you might say to a coachee or the person you're coaching, if you were observing yourself right now in this emotion, what would you notice? So it helps take a little bit of that connection to the emotion away. Or you might say, if you hold that emotion up in your hand, what would you see? So that you can really take it out of the person and non-identify or non-associate with it, so that you can look at it from an objective perspective that will help you potentially to challenge your perspective on it. So all of this today was about recognizing that grief is real. We need to validate it. We don't always know why we're feeling grief, for what reason, because sometimes it's delayed, sometimes it's secondary, sometimes it's ambiguous, sometimes it's disenfranchised. There are different ways of looking at grief, and sometimes it's collective. And so we want to just recognize that grief shows up in different ways. And when we have a client who comes in showing symptoms of grief, the first place to sit is compassion, as a coach or as a human being. The second place to sit is empathy, an empathetic space that is safe for someone to feel what they feel. And then looking at these strategies on potentially supporting people through grief as a coach or as a friend. So thank you so much for joining today. I hope this was helpful. And tune in next week for episode 6 as we sit with our wonderful, incredible, amazing facilitator in our community. Her name is Kelly Wood. She is an accomplished executive and leadership coach, and of course, facilitator and mentor in our community and in her own personal practice. She will be talking about how she built her practice, as well as her passion for coaching. So see you next week, and thanks again for tuning in. Bye for now.